like most everybody else in the world, the other week I sat down to watch Queen Charlotte, the Bridgerton story, or Bridgerton, Queen Charlotte. You know what I'm talking about. I don't actually know how they titled it. While yes, I was forced to watch within like the first 5 minutes that extremely cringy monologue about whalebone, that was like awkward.
The bones of whales, whales died so I could look like this.
What I actually had the worst reaction to when it comes to Bridgerton is this.
Assistance of some kind.
No, not that.
What are you doing?
This.
Bess is trying to go over a wall so that she does not have to marry me.
Yeah, that. And I know you might be like, what? What do you mean? Like, it's just hair, Abby. I don't understand what the big deal is. Watching the actor come out as King George on the day of his wedding, looking like he is the star football player in his senior year of high school, who has just been told that he doesn't have enough credits to graduate, and the only way he can have enough credits to graduate so he can go on and play college football is if he stars in the senior play. And it was extremely jarring, and it actually completely ripped me out of the fantasy and the believability of the show. I absolutely hated it. And I'm not one to really give a lot of shits about Bridgerton's costumes. I literally did a whole video when it first came out about like why the historical accuracy of Bridgerton's costumes doesn't matter. It's a fantasy world. And yes, Queen Charlotte's like season series, whatever, is kind of weird because it's in this weird in between. It is a fantasy because it's Bridgerton, it's an alternate universe, but also Queen Charlotte and the story that they're telling is based off of historical fact and record. His hair, it really upset me. And I was like, okay, well, self, you can either go to therapy and talk about it, or you can therapy yourself. And I decided to save some money and not waste my therapist's time. And here's what I realized. The first moment we see George is right before one of the most, second only to his coronation, important moments and most formal moments of his life as royalty, his royal wedding. And for him to walk out with just like a 2-month-old buzz cut growing out, the juxtaposition of the formality of that moment and the informality of his hair, it just really, really ripped me out of the believability of the story. But what it did make me also realize is that I've never actually really talked to you guys about wigs. Even though literally my expertise is in 18th century hairdressing and hair care, and I literally have written a book about 18th century hairdressing, and my most popular video on this channel is about how I used to pomade and powder my hair. I've literally made pomade and powder on this channel before, like we've talked about 18th century haircuts. We've talked about 18th century hair on this channel, and yet, I've never talked to you all about wigs, I don't think. It's been a minute. I don't think I have. Anyways, I'm gonna talk to you all about wigs today because I figured Bridgerton was a good segue into it, and I frankly need to get a lot of this off my chest. One of the biggest misconceptions around 18th century hair and wigs is that
1 minute, 37 seconds later.
Everyone wore them. Men, women, and children. Yes, I have literally had people try and tell me that children, small children, wore full wigs in the 18th century. I know, it's one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. And that the reason everyone wore wigs was either one, to achieve those huge Marie Antoinette hairstyles, or because everyone was infested with lice, vermin, filth. Everyone had to wear wigs because everyone was so filthy back in the day. And quite simply, this isn't true. So when we look at actual hairdressing manuals from the 18th century, especially when hair was at its biggest, so the 1770s and the 1780s, what we actually see are a lot of instructions on how to cut, frizz, style, pad, and design women's hair using hair pieces, but never full wigs. The tutorials and the instructions are always centered around utilizing the woman's actual hair on her head to create those large fashionable styles. And through my own experimentation using 18th century hair products, I have also been able to reproduce some massive hairstyles that would have been at the height of vanity and popularity in the 1770s. So it's not to say that women didn't utilize fake hair. They absolutely did, but it's not too dissimilar to how we utilize fake hair today. Now, there are absolutely cases where women did wear wigs. Unfortunately, the imagery around women wearing wigs, especially the satirical images, which is where we're gonna see this sort of stuff, they are not kind to wig-wearing women. Usually the women are depicted as being old and sick, or arguably worse, extremely vain, and possibly not completely healthy when it comes to venereal diseases. I cannot stress this enough. The images around women wearing wigs is incredibly cruel, even though we know today that there are plenty of medical reasons as to why women might need to wear a wig, whether it's postpartum hair loss, alopecia, hormone imbalances, age, female pattern baldness, stress, change in diet, etc. Furthermore, that iconic big hair of the 1700s that we think of when we think of like Marie Antoinette and just like that era in general was actually a really small period of time. For the first like 68 years of the 1700s, women's hair was actually worn relatively low and close to the head. It wasn't until the 1770s that we actually start to see the hair grow in height, peaking around 1776 or so. From there, it continues to widen out until we get the rounded frizzy shape of the 1780s. That frizzy shape continues up until about the mid 1790s, where in keeping with the French government, the hair collapses. It is still worn curly, but just a lot closer to the head than what it was just about 5-10 years ago. So for the majority of the century, women's hair was actually worn really, really low and quite small, completely negating the aesthetic need for a wig. Like the women just really didn't need one. So when you think about it, the 18th century brought about a huge radical change in society. Whether it was your art, science, politics, philosophy, just everything changed in the 18th century. So in 1667, Robert Hooke published Micrographia, which completely changed how physicians, scientists, and even normies understood disease and health and science in a way that completely changed our worldview. The 18th century is also when we see the Enlightenment, and we see this huge societal shift away from being church-led and religion-led to being focused on reason and logic and science to make our decisions. The dominant medical philosophy at this point in time too, up until about the end of the 18th century, mid-18th century, was the humoral, like medicinal philosophy, you know, that like we have the 4 humors and we have to keep them in balance. And that also affected how we understood how diseases were spread. Now, I also just want to take a quick note. People did understand basic hygiene. This whole idea that people were just like covered in like filth is just, they understood to wash their hands, which honestly is saying a lot more than some of you all out there. When viewing the body from the humoral, like, health perspective, women were viewed as being moist and leaky. That's what she said.
That's what she said.
Which is why doctors believed that women were able to grow their hair long, because we were like an ideal growing environment, and men were dry and hot. And they would become drier as they got older, which is not an ideal growing environment for hair, thus how they understood male pattern baldness and hair loss as men grow older. And with all that being said though, what I've always heard is that women get drier as they get older, so. Yeah. So it's with this understanding of how baldness works and male pattern baldness that we start to kind of get an idea of why men started wearing wigs, because long hair was considered a sign of good health. One of the most important aspects of 18th century society and culture was that they believed that your outside appearance was a reflection of your internal self. And so you needed to present a good outward appearance in order to reflect who you were as a person. What that means is that you would not be going to the Walmart in Cookie Monster pajama bottoms in the 18th century. That would literally send all of the American colonies and Great Britain into a coma, okay? Like, it just wouldn't happen. George Washington could never. And so in order to present this illusion of good health, men started to wear wigs in the mid 17th century. So Charles II, Louis XIV. And they had these nice long full wigs. So this is supposed to show this healthy male vigor, this sexual appetite. But overall, this really good idea of health and wellness. Furthermore, one of the ideas about hair was that they thought it was hollow. it allowed disease to come in. So keeping your hair covered was an act of hygiene. It was a protective and preventative health practice in order to prevent you from getting sick. By men shaving their heads and wearing a wig, they are in fact actually protecting their own hair and protecting themselves from the possibility of getting sick by wearing the wig. Now, with all that being said, the rapid changes in medicine throughout the 18th century can actually line up almost perfectly with the growth and fall of the popularity of men wearing wigs. And by the time we kind of leave humoral medicine completely by the wayside in the 18th century, it is around the same time that men actually, for the most part, stop wearing wigs and start dressing their own hair. But we also see a shift away from pomade and powder and to washing your hair by the end of the 18th century. And this then ties into the fashion of wigs. 18th century Anglo-American views on fashion are complicated. It was extremely important that you looked correct for your social status, for your income level, for your gender, for all of it. But also you didn't want to look too over the top. You know what I mean? Like, there was definitely like a fine line of acceptability when it comes to what you wore, how you dressed, and how you presented yourself. And wig wearing was a part of this. And in Emma Markowitz's PhD about 18th century wig wearing and the hair industry, she uses this as an example of why we should not view wigs as a wholly fashion item or as a luxury good. If a person claimed to wear a wig for reasons of protecting their health or for curative purposes, this was considered much more respectable than those who chose to wear one to appear fashionable, which was considered frivolous and vain. So she goes on to quote physician John Bockett's book, Pride Exposed and Opposed from 1710. Okay, so this is still in like the very big wig era. Some men, not esteeming a good head of hair that God by his providence hath bestowed upon them, fashionable enough, they will cut it off under pretense to cure the headache. This was a common remedy if you suffered from like chronic migraines and headaches, was to cut all your hair off. When sometimes twice as much of another color is worn in the room of it, and at an extravagant length too. To translate, don't cut all your hair off claiming it's for health and then wear a wig that is bigger, that is not your actual hair color, and claim it's for health reasons. We both know that you're just being a vain bitch, okay?
Bombastic side eye. Criminal offensive side eye.
So you can kind of see how it's like, yes, you can wear a wig for fashion. Yes, you can wear a wig for health. But if you're wearing it for health, it better not be too fashionable because then we'll judge you. It was a very thin line to walk. The 18th century, they were full of judgy bitches, okay? To be a man in the 18th century meant you wore a wig, usually, at least for a good part of the 17th and 18th century. Circling back then to Queen Charlotte and the show, this is kind of, I think, ultimately where it gets down to why I had such issues with George's hair. This idea of wealth, status, being a gentleman, being respectable in public, looking a certain way in public, and how your public appearance was so important in the 18th century. To have his hair just be a grown-out buzz cut, it's just so wrong for the 18th century on so many levels that it feels like a mistake. Like it genuinely feels like he forgot to wear his wig on set the first day and then they were like, well, oh well, I guess we're just gonna roll with it. I think if they had had him in a wig as a young man, I understand how that might not have been appealing to modern audiences, but I would also argue his grown-out buzz cut isn't either. But I would say if they had put him in a wig as a young man, because I know that he's wearing a wig as an older man, it could have actually provided a lot of storytelling. In the scene where he's yelling at Catelyn Stark about being the king and being George, and I can't remember if that was in the second episode or Even Days, you know, and he's like, I'm the king and I'm George, and da-da-da-da-da. I'm like, well, that juxtaposition actually could have been really interesting with a wig, because he could have like literally taken the wig off and slammed it on the table when he was like saying like he is George, and like George is the one with the shorter hair and the king is the one with the wig on. And then also like in the whole Even Days episode and all of those sequences, like having a moment where like Charlotte like rips his wig off so she can get to George would have also been some not only comedic but really interesting storytelling for what it meant to be a king at this point in time and the idea of your public persona and your private persona. And I just think having him with nothing didn't actually do him a lot of favors costuming wise, and I think they missed a really great opportunity to help tell the story through his makeup, wigs, and costuming.
Farmer George.
Yes. Farmer George. I am Farmer George.
Now, as for wigs being considered a luxury or a status item, well, yes, you could definitely argue that in the very beginning of wig wearing in the 1600s. By the 18th century, that is not the case, okay? You know, it's like so many things. It might have started out as a luxury item, but very, very quickly, it becomes accessible to different social statuses. The secondhand wig market was thriving. There was even something called dipping for wigs, which is when a man would pay a small fee, he would just basically stick his hand into a grab bag of wigs and pull one out and just hope that it fit his head and then it didn't look like total shit. So he would have a wig to wear, you know? Everyone of different social statuses were wearing wigs, and wigs also could be made out of cheaper materials like horsehair. Horsehair also would hold up better to styling and wouldn't need as much upkeep as a human hair wig, so it was a much more affordable option. But wigs were also stolen because they could be so valuable that they were common targets for thieves and highway robbers. Additionally, as the 18th century went on, wigs stopped being a symbol of fashion and luxury, but just kind of evolved into a representation of masculinity, and masculinity for all social statuses and all social levels. And so while yes, there were fashionable wigs and the styles for wigs would change, and you definitely had people wearing fashionable wigs and unfashionable wigs, we do also start to see a rise of dressing your own hair in the 18th century come back for men, because they were employing hairstylists, hairdressers, valets to take the time to actually dress their own hair versus just throwing a wig on. But certain wig styles actually became associated with the working class and the middle class, which for the aristocracy is essentially a social suicide. It's a social death sentence, if you will. Quote, "She objected to some few articles in his dress, which he smilingly told her was the uniform of a tradesman and could not with propriety be laid aside." So he's a tradesman, that is who he is. He's middling sort, he works for his money. And as a tradesman, this particular wig is a symbol and a representation of his social status. Continuing, "He was a short time told in so many words that unless he would exchange his bob wig for a queue, so exchange this style of wig for this hairstyle, he must then lose the lady, and the marriage prospect would fall through." Well, he stuck to the bob and he is still a bachelor. By the end of the 18th century, yes, there are still some men wearing wigs, of course. I mean, barristers in the UK today still wear wigs for criminal court. Those wig styles are 18th century wig styles. Wig wearing hasn't actually stopped for men. It is still very much a thing that happens in the UK. But between the changes in medical understanding as well as fashion throughout the 18th century, we do see men leave off their wigs by the end of the century to favor dressing their own hair. By the early 1800s, we actually see the hygienic shift away from dry washing your hair in pomade and powder to washing it in water. And so we have, by the end of the century, just a complete and total shift away from wig wearing and hair powder and pomade to like washed hair with soap and water, and also shorter hair for men as well. So that's wigs. They were sort of fashionable, sort of not, required for men, but not for women. And they were a huge part of our culture for about 150 years or so. And so I hope this kind of helps explain wigs to you all a little bit, especially for those of you who might not have fully understood why people wore wigs or why men specifically wore wigs. And also this helps kind of get off my chest how much I hated George's hair in Queen Charlotte. So with that, if you all enjoyed this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. That helps me and you with the algorithm. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I would really appreciate it. And with that, my friends, I'll see you all back here in a couple weeks with another video. Goodbye! That's an 18th century toilet table. So this is where you would sit to put your makeup on, to dress your hair, to put the wig on your head. And it has little containers. It has like little things. I love it so much. She is my favorite find. And this table could be used by both men and women, so that's why she's out. That's why we have a different angle.